So what I'm going to do from the outset is I'm going to put you to work. But so don't worry, it's not a lot from you. I just have 2 questions that I'm looking to get an answer from. So the first of these is I'm going to ask, so those of you who think you could describe to someone what groundwater is, could I just get you to raise your hand? Some. So the other one might be, if you turn the water on at the tap, do you ever think about where that water comes from? So a little bit more. So why is it that many of us don't think about some of our most precious resources? So the title of my talk is Making the Invisible Visible. This is a talk about groundwater. And the thought behind this title is that because groundwater is out of sight, it's often out of mind to the point where it's invisible to us. And so the hope from this talk is that I can do a little bit to change that today. So this is a photo of my hometown, so Bordertown in South Australia, and my house is kind of in the background of this photo. And so a fun fact about Bordertown, so it's the birthplace of former Prime Minister Bob Hawke. So I'll let you look up your own fun facts about Bob Hawke, there are many. But what's relevant about this story and Bordertown is that our town water supply was sourced from groundwater. So when I lived in Bordertown, I knew that droughts hit hard. So I went to school throughout the Millennium Drought, but I can honestly say that I thought about groundwater exactly 0 times in the 19 years that I lived in Bordertown because it was invisible to me. And so I'm glad that you're all sitting down because I'm about to describe to you what groundwater is. And it really is water that's stored under the ground. Shock. But there's a couple of important points that I want to make while we're here. So the first of these is that we're typically talking about water that's moving potentially quite slowly, so around 1 metre per year. And then that water is typically moving through pore spaces in rocks and sediment. So we're talking about the glamorous world of wet rocks and wet dirt. So when I asked you about groundwater earlier, I'm pretty sure that some of you would have been thinking about this, so underground rivers. And so while these can occur in places like caves and the like, we're almost never talking about this kind of situation when we're talking about groundwater. So if you ever meet someone who says that they can find one of these underground rivers with a magic stick, back away slowly because I'm sorry to break it to you, but that water divining is not a real thing. And so we know that water's precious. And so I like to use this diagram to really make this point. And so this is what the world would look like if we take away all of the water. And it's represented in that ball there that's sitting on top of the US. And what we're going to do is we're going to break down the water that's in this ball and we're going to show where around the world it's located. So we're zooming in now. And so this is now all of the water that's on Earth. And so I hope it's not going to come as a great surprise to you if I tell you that most of the water on the planet Earth is in the ocean. So it's salty and it's not necessarily immediately useful to us. So if we zoom into our next ball here, we now have all of the fresh water that we have on the planet. But again, most of the water that we have that's fresh is also frozen. So it's locked up in things like ice caps and ice sheets. And so I hope you can see it, but if we zoom in even further, this is now all of the fresh and liquid water that we have on the planet Earth. And so if I'm trying to make the point that it's precious, I really hope that this is doing the job. And so one of the things that I want to really emphasize now, and I'm going to ask you another question, but don't worry, there's no hands involved, is what percentage of the fresh and liquid water that we have on Earth do you think is stored underground? So maybe 1 to 2, maybe 5, maybe 10. So it's actually 98% of all the fresh and liquid water that we have on Earth is stored underground. It's just that we don't see it, and it's invisible to us. But I would like to just push back on this a little, because I think the world's a little bit more complicated than we often make it seem. So this is a photo of the Murray River in South Australia. And so for those of you who aren't aware, the Murray-Darling Basin is known as the food bowl of Australia. But so the question here is, if you see a river like this and it hasn't rained for 6 months, where do you think that water's coming from? And so it turns out that we have groundwater coming in from below and it's propping up its flashier surface water cousin. And it turns out that this is a really important process globally. And it turns out here that more than half of all river flows globally are based on this process. And so if you're there in the summertime or in the dry season up here, it could be 100% of that water that you see in a river is being fed below from groundwater. And this is something that I just think people should know. Because if you don't live near dams or major rivers, where do you think people are getting their water from? Hopefully it's clear by now that these people are going to be sourcing their water from groundwater. So the current population is around 8 billion, and it turns out that about 2.5 billion people are completely reliant on groundwater for their water supply. But we know that the population is growing, and so by 2100, we're projected to have potentially an additional 600 million people on the planet Earth that are completely reliant on groundwater for their daily needs. So to put this in perspective, this is roughly twice the population of the present-day US, or if this was a country, only current-day China or India would have a bigger population than this. And so this is potentially a really big problem. Because climate change is coming. And this can be a really hard area to work in. And so I still remember last year reading this, that we've probably already exceeded the point where we can have the best case scenario from the IPCC scenarios, or maybe the least worst. And that really hit me when I read that. So these are impacts that I'm going to feel in my lifetime, but that I have small children. And so I really think about the world that we're passing on to them. And it does get hard. Because we know that we're facing a world that's going to be warmer. And it's just a question of how much warmer. But when it comes to rainfall, this is where things get a little bit trickier. So some of our global climate models suggest that regions are going to get wetter, while other global climate models might suggest that that same location is going to get drier. So these are really complex processes for us to try and understand, and this is only actually the rainfall part of the story. So hydrological scientists have to take this data and we have to try and work out what's going to happen after this. Very complicated. But what the models tend to agree on is that the rain that we do get is likely to be delivered in more intense events. So we're potentially looking at a situation where we can transfer between having droughts and floods. And so the point here becomes, how do you think people are going to treat surface water resources in the future when they become less reliable? We're likely to be more reliant on groundwater in the future. And so I use this saying about being invisible. I just wanted to make the point that there's lots about groundwater that's invisible to me too. So our best way of looking in the subsurface is to use the existing bore network that's available. But bores are really expensive to drill. And a lot of the samples that we collect can cost upwards of $1,000, and we need lots of these to understand how a system works. So this is really complicated. But I also think that we have to work with some of the hardest parameters to deal with in all of science. And so to try and make this point, I looked up the difference in speed between a cheetah and a snail, and a cheetah is about 3,000 times faster than a snail. That's kind of cute. So in a hydrological example, a gravel can have a hydraulic conductivity that's 100 billion times greater than that of a clay, and we can have these two materials located in the same location. So this makes our job very difficult. Very, very difficult to understand. But so the point here is, if you're going to keep wearing clothes, I hope you are, if you're going to keep eating food, then we're going to need to keep pumping groundwater. And with climate change and population growth, we're going to potentially need to be pumping more groundwater. And so the point for me is that we need to be understanding what the potential impacts might be and to try and minimise these as best we can. But I've already explained that these processes are really hard to understand. We've got a lot of work that we need to do, and the world, and particularly Australia, is screaming out for people to be working in this area. But this is a wicked problem that we're going to need to have industry, universities, and schools to work together to try and change this problem, because people are not going to study something that they've never even heard about. And so that's why I sort of put myself on this job here of trying to make the invisible visible. But I thought it should be a good idea to talk about how I got here. So I got here completely by accident. So I never sought to be a scientist. I never even thought about taking a PhD. So my story was, I saw a lecture from a really enthusiastic lecturer, and it was about water resources. I changed degrees, that person became my PhD supervisor, and here I am. And so when I told my parents that I was going to do a PhD in groundwater, they were pretty surprised, but not for the reason that you might expect. So it wasn't because they were wondering what the hell I was talking about. It's because they said, Dylan, did you know that your grandpa was a bore driller? And I had absolutely no idea. And so it turns out that some important things do their work quietly. And so for me, it turns out that my town water supply, my career, and then evidently my family were all shaped by groundwater. It's just that I wasn't aware of it. And so that's kind of the point, because I think this is true for lots of people. But what's also true is that some things are really important whether we know about them or not. So the world's potentially facing some challenging problems with water resources into the future, and we need more people to be working in this area, which is why I was so happy to have this opportunity to try and make the invisible, a little bit more visible. So thank you.